my mother was born in Dawlish, born and bred, never left Dawlish. My father happened to be in Dawlish. He was in fact a Cockney, but he was working at Luscombe Castle in the gardens. It was during the when there was no work. His brother-in-law was a head gardener there and got him a job as a jobbing gardener. And family story is he was walking along the seafront one day and he saw this young lady, and that was it, as they say. Seemed to be love at first sight. They were married a few years later, and then my mother left Dawlish. But Dawlish was still very important to her. Obviously, she was born and bred in Dawlish. And I first came here when I was 2 months old. We would go down to the beach on our own. Nobody seemed to think that any harm would come to us. We were told various things, don't get in the water too deep and don't do this, don't do that. And we spent a lot of time going down there. We would bring back buckets of seawater for my granny, who reckoned it was good for the eczema on her arms. There were so many shops in High Street and Old Town Street. That was the main shopping area. We would go up there to do the shopping. The Co-op was up there. There were butchers, there was greengrocers, you name it. It was up there. To go down the Strand, that was for something special. We never seemed to go out of Dawlish to do shopping. We might have had a trip out to Exeter or something as a real treat, but not as often as people would do it today. Now, there was a shop at the end of Golden Terrace where it goes on to Towntree Hill. There's a little wall there. If anybody's familiar with that area, there is a wall there, and it's got a sort of steepled top to it. My cousin and myself would go and sit there for ages just watching the world go by. And there was a shop there called Frau's, and it was a little general store. It's a block of, not a block of flats, it's been turned into flats now. There is a proper block of flats further up the road. And there used to be a slogan in the Dawlish Gazette along the lines of avoid the crowds and shop at Frau's. The carnival was a big event, even during the war. And during the war, the Carnival Queen was chosen by the young lady who collected most for the given charity. They'd have charities to buy a Spitfire. I don't think they could buy a whole Spitfire, but to put towards it and that sort of thing. And all the local young ladies, I was too young for any of that sort of thing, but most of the young ladies would have various fundraising events to get money for it, and the one that got the most was the Carnival Queen.
Can you describe what we're looking at in that picture?
Well, I would think that would be one of the fete days down on the lawn. They used to have, and it was usually tied up with the carnival. It wasn't a full week of celebration like they do now, but when the carnival, they had a big fete usually. And obviously, I would think by looking at that photo that, for a couple of pennies maybe, you could have a ride on a horse and various other side shows and whatever. I can remember when you could roll a penny down a little slope, and if it landed on something that said tuppence, you got tuppence back or something. And I do remember once at the carnival fete, I found a shilling. It was just lying on the ground, and I picked it up very surreptitiously. My parents, Elsie and Bert, and I would think, if my birthday's in April, this is obviously in the summer, I would think I was probably maybe 14, 15 months old there. I can't say I remember that visit, but that shows that, it was from that age, well, even before that age. And there used to be the tennis courts behind. I do vaguely remember the tennis courts. Well, I had one friend who lived near my grandmother's called Sheila Hooper. And she and I used to play with our dolls a lot. And there are steps up and down to the houses in Golden Terrace. They're still there, the houses are still there. And we would have our dollies sitting all the way up the steps. That was a very dolly little girl. and Sheila the same. But she had twin brothers, and they were a bit of a pest because they kept coming and moving our dollies as little boys too, with their older sisters and whatever. We used to go to the Newey quite a lot. And in the far corner, as you go into the Newey, the far corner on the left where the waterfall is, which was a far more impressive waterfall in those days, it's just a bit of a trickle. We used to go and sit there and talk. I don't know what we used to talk about because we were only little girls, but we used to go there quite a lot. But bearing in mind that by now it was wartime, we would just let go, you know. We didn't have watches or anything, so we'd come back at dinner time. If not, you don't get any dinner. My godmother, she married a Mr. Bodley. Where he came from, I don't know. He was in Dawlish, but I mean, how she met him or whatever, I don't know. And he, in turn, was landlord of the Red Lion pub. I can't remember much about the pub because we were actually scuttled through because, you know, it wasn't right for children to go in pubs in those days. But I remember the garden at the back was very, very steep. We used to have great fun sort of rolling down it and that, you know. Another place that featured quite a lot was the White Hart pub. We used to go along to the White Hart and into the passage at the side. Now, I suppose at this time I was about 10, well, maybe, no, not 11, my grandfather had died before I was down here then. Maybe 9 or 10, and he was very well known, but he was bedridden then. And it was when you could take your jug along and get a... And although I was only a child, I could go to the passage at the side, hand the jug over, and they knew it was for Tom Comstock. And I think he paid up once a week or settled a bill or something. And I would take his pint of whatever it was back. Another thing that I always found very boring when I was in Dawlish, I hate to say it about Dawlish, but my grandmother was very keen on whist drives. And after my grandfather died, I was down here for quite a long time with just my granny. And she liked her whist drives up at the Conservative Club, which is still up there. And I used to have to go up there and sit and watch these old ladies playing whist. And it was probably only for an hour and a half, but it seemed forever, a couple of times a week. And I used to absolutely dread it. I was walking with my father out on the Teignmouth Road, and this plane came over and it was shooting all the way along the coast. And then, I presume it was a Spitfire, an English fighter of some sort, came along and shot it down. And I think it was Torquay Beach it came down. It was either Torquay or Plymouth, but it came down on one of the beaches further up the coast. And I was very indignant about that, because I'd been sent there to be away from all this wartime goings on. There were some shelters built, there was one or two on the lawn, one down where the duck enclosure is, and another one up by the bowling green. I can remember those two being down there. There were a lot of American soldiers here. They weren't actually stationed here, but they used to be down, I think it was the Royal Hotel, the one down near the station. And we would go down and ask them for sweets. And they were lovely, they would give us sweets. I mean, imagine telling children now to go down to a group of soldiers and ask them for sweets. They weren't actually stationed in Dawlish. I'm not quite sure where they came from, but I think they used to have dances down at the hotel and whatever. And there was one girl in Golden Terrace, a neighbour of my granny's, who actually married an American. And wow, you know, we all had to go out and see the wedding. And in those days, they would go on honeymoon from the station, they'd get married and then go off on honeymoon. And all the neighbours were going down to the station cheering this couple on who'd got married and see them go on the train to go off on their honeymoon somewhere. There was a young lad, a few years older than me, lived further along the terrace. I think it's 7 cottages along there. Might be 8, I won't be sure. And he had scarlet fever and they had to get the ambulance for him, but you can't get any traffic down into Golden Terrace. So that was parked on Town Tree Hill and sort of looking out as neighbours do. And this young lad came, I can't remember his name, he came along and he'd got a red blanket wrapped around him. He could just about walk. And from then on, I always associated scarlet fever. You got it. If you had a red blanket wrapped around you, so it'd be scarlet and whatever. And he obviously recovered, although I can't remember him coming back, but he did. I know he was there at a later time. But being in such an enclosed little area, everything that went on, everybody knew. Sometimes you had homemade sweets, but there again sugar was rationed, but you could make toffee and toffee apples in season and things like that. And ice cream, no, couldn't get it anywhere. After the war, they used to sell ice cream down on the seafront, and word would go around like wildfire that the ice cream's been delivered, and all the children would go down, and my cousin and myself would go down. But we pretended we weren't together because you were only allowed so much. We would queue up with a couple of people in between so we could get twice as much. We didn't have telephones were invented, obviously, but we hadn't got telephone, neither here or at home. But we'd arrange sometimes to go and phone from the red call box to a neighbour who'd got a telephone. Like I would phone home to my parents, maybe about 12 or 13 at this age, old enough to use the phone. But also, I would go and sit down by the station on the viaduct for hours watching the trains coming down from London, because both my parents were doing war work, and if they got a long weekend off, they would come down. They didn't have to let Granny know, they could just turn up, and I would go down there and wait and hope that they were going to be, one or the other of them would be on that train to come down. And I remember my father came down once. He spoiled me rotten. And for some reason, my mother would never let me have baked beans. I don't know the background to it, but we weren't allowed baked beans. And my father came down, we had a weekend together, and I can remember sitting on the seafront, and somehow or other we got talking. And he took me over to Exmouth. I think we probably went into Starcross and went across on the ferry, because I seem to remember going on a boat. And he took me into a restaurant there and got me baked beans on toast and said, "Don't tell your mother baked beans." Because he was like that, my dad, he'd spoil me rotten. We were lucky because although my grandfather had been a career sailor, he had also been a fisherman on the side, and the family, the Cumstock family, were quite well-known local fishermen. But we did have a lot of fish, and Mr. Dart, who used to come round with a wheelbarrow, and of course knew my grandfather, because all the fisher folk all knew one another. And we used to have a lot of fish, because fish wasn't rationed. There again, it wasn't a case of saying, well, I want plaice today. Whatever fish they'd got, you would have. I wasn't really happy with the milk coming the way it did into a jug, because I don't like milk anyway. But and Granny always did what she called scalded it, which was boiled it up.
Like pasteurised it, basically.
Yeah, because there was no fridge. And no matter how you strained it, there was always little bits of cream would get through, and you'd have a cup of tea and you'd have all these white blobs floating on top.